focus of our conversation today are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the UN just a few months ago in September 2015. Ban Ki-moon has described these goals as representing a shared vision of humanity and a social contract between the world's leaders and its people. Summing up, it's a to-do list for people and planet. So at the RSA today, we're going to consider what the UK should be doing in order to turn this vision into reality.
Last summer, as many of you will know, we undertook a quite large-ranging inquiry where we had over 100 submissions from organisations looking at the government's approach to sustainability in a wide range, from energy, natural environment, sustainable development goals, everything was in there. We followed that up in the autumn with a large open table event where about 150 people attended in the House of Commons, and we had a great panel there of experts to discuss what we'd heard in there. We'd heard in some of the written evidence, for example, that there was praise for some of the government's approach to issues that will touch on the Sustainable Development Goals, things like natural capital accounting being put into a 25-year plan, being embedded into government. But we also heard some real criticism as well of where government was, the difference between their high-level aspirations and the great work that they've just done on a high-level ambition coalition coming out of COP21 compared with some of the very mixed signals that were happening here domestically. When we held that big event, the Green Alliance, who were on the panel, they thought that recent government policy announcement meant that the urgent, in terms of government priorities and political priorities, had actually trumped the important. And this is a key thing with Sustainable Development Goals. How do you make sure that they stick with the long term and what they need to do, as opposed to what the electorate might think is demanding them to do in the short term in order to win the next election or get to the next budget statement? And the Green Alliance also thought that the government was seen to have a compliance approach to the environment, do what's necessary, but no further, which is a big issue when you talk about SDGs. The Wildlife Trust, welcomed some of the progress made, particularly on things like the marine environment, although I have to say we have to do a hell of a lot more. But they also criticised issues around housing decisions and planning decisions. Marks and Spencer's, the spokesman from there, were very progressive. They talked about the need for things like a real, simple, stable carbon price. The change in narrative, Marks and Spencer said, to one of green growth. Let's get back onto that. And the Committee on Climate Change flagged up some progress, but again painted a very mixed picture, including on things like climate change adaptation with flood responses to flood. Real long-term thinking seemed to be absent. They noted, for example, that recently there had been some announcements for increasing in flood spending, but it was nowhere near actually the holistic approach we needed to dealing with flood management and response to climate change adaptation. So all of those take me forward to some thoughts on where should we be going. How do we monitor and measure government? Well, we brought in government ministers to respond to what we'd heard through the autumn, through the summer. Oliver Letwin said in terms of sustainability, this is now a mainstream part of the government's agenda. We do not see sustainable development as a separate bit sitting around. It's how we do business. And on accountability, he said, I guess that I'm the most likely to be the person who's sacked by the Prime Minister if it all goes wrong. So in that sense, I suppose there's a line of accountability, because for me as a policymaker, we want to know where the buck stops. But in fairness to Oliver Letwin, he explained how wide-ranging the SDGs are. He said they couldn't be brought together by one person. He said they have to be handled in a serious-minded way by the great big departments of state. And echoing the National Audit Office, he echoed them when he said that reporting on and monitoring performance was what the government was trying to do through single departmental plans. But I would put to you, single departmental plans can end up in silo thinking. When we're talking about SDGs, including whether it's international development, the Foreign Office, domestically within DEFRA, DEC, whatever, you actually need joined up thinking as well. When the Sustainable Development Commission was abandoned back in 2010, the Conservative ministers of the time said, don't worry about that, that's okay. The ones who'll take over will be the Environmental Audit Committee. Now, what the SDC used to do was set the metrics as to how to hold government to account, and regularly, at least annually, would produce the report that says whether they had achieved it or not. And I think we need to think about that with Sustainable Development Goals as well, because they traffic light departments, individuals, government as a whole, to say whether they were red, amber or green, and that put the fear of God through ministers, through secretaries of states, through departments. They've got to be held accountable and measured and monitored and pushed further. We need to look at measurement, monitoring, performance, and doing that on a regular, systematic basis on government. Otherwise, ministers retreat into a comfort zone.
I've been working on the Sustainable Development Goals now for about a year, really working on the negotiation process at the UN and really looking to get an outcome as best as possible for the world's most vulnerable children. So Save the Children has been engaging at the UN level during the negotiations, but we've also been working at regional level and then at national level as well to really kind of push for an agreement that puts the furthest behind first. So the new agenda was agreed by 193 member states and it charts a new course compared with the MDGs. So I would characterise the three major shifts as being narrative, because the SDGs represent a real advance in how we will view success. So getting to zero on extreme poverty and preventable child deaths. Leaving no one behind by delivering change for all and not some. So meeting the targets for all nations, all peoples and for all segments of society. The agreement integrates social, economic and environmental issues as well, and it's universal, so it applies to all countries. My second shift is the normative shift. So the Sustainable Development Goals offer wins at some of the most progressive limits of development. So on governance, peaceful and inclusive societies, on gender and sexual and reproductive health, on inequality, there's a whole goal on inequality in there, and on climate change as well. And then thirdly, on ownership. So the SDGs are an agenda of the people, by the people, for the people. So that means transparent, inclusive development and a negotiation process over 3 years, which involved global citizens, civil society, UN member states. It was the most participatory process in UN history. Compared with the MDGs, it also has been shaped and agreed by all as well. So no member state can say that they don't apply or that they haven't been involved in any way, shape or form. There's real ownership on this agenda and so therefore real ownership in the delivery as well. But for Save the Children, I would say one of the most transformational commitments that we see in this final agreement is the commitment to leave no one behind. The commitment in there is to put the furthest behind first and to deliver on this agreement to make sure that these targets are met for everybody. And it applies to all countries. Save the Children have been campaigning at the UN to make sure that this commitment on meeting the goals and targets for what we were saying would be for all social and economic groups was included in the agenda. And so we spent a lot of time talking to member states, both at the UN and at national level. And by the end of the negotiations, 84 member states had backed this and 3,200 civil society organisations around the world. And so in terms of implementing this amazing agenda, now that we have the 17 goals and 169 targets, there are a couple of UN level processes that are yet to be tied up. So the first is on indicators. So we have the goals, we have the targets, and now the indicators about how we're going to be able to measure these. And there's a global process happening at the moment around what these indicators look like, with the idea being that at national level, then governments can come up with their own national level indicators that sort of play into those. And the other one is on accountability or follow-up and review. So the final agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals is split into 5 parts: the preamble, the declaration, the goals and targets, means of implementation, which is more about how they're going to deliver them and the financial and non-financial implications of that, and then follow-up and review, which is essentially accountability, and that process to work out, what these accountability mechanisms will look like at the global, regional and national levels is ongoing at the moment and should culminate in the high-level political forum which is being held at the UN in July.
The achievement of getting the SDGs in place is a remarkable one. And whilst there's still a lot of work to do, I think very strongly, at least in rhetoric, political rhetoric, this is a major step forward. It is a recognition that the answer to the poverty problem is not just economic growth, it is sustainable development. That being said, there are some major challenges we have to now face in the implementation of the goals, which essentially started just over a month ago on the 1st of January. I want to talk about 3 things in particular. The first point is around universality. The second is around integration. And the third aspect is multi-stakeholderism. These goals cannot be achieved through public policy alone. Universality. This is a point that I do not think can be said often enough or more loudly enough. These goals are for everybody. They are global goals for humanity's future. And for me, universality represents a pact between developing countries and developed countries, in the sense that if we are asking developing countries to leapfrog a form of development and derive new development pathways to get to the point of development that we have experienced now, the types of standards of living that we experience, that is the hard thing to do. I mean, they are foregoing the way we did, which is through rampant natural resource and fossil fuel exploitation. They're going to have to do it the hard way. If we're asking them to do that, in return, we've made a deal, which is that we will look at changing our socioeconomic patterns and lifestyles to be more sustainable. And if they don't see us being bothered to do this, they will turn around and say, well, to hell with it. We're just going to develop the way you did, i.e. through natural resource exploitation. And the world will be going to hell in a handbasket. Universality matters so much. It's more than a principle. It is a concept. It's a deal. We have to get it right. The second point on integration, in a former report, Stakeholder Forum characterized 3 types of integration and then analyzed the SDGs to see how well they were done. The 3 types are taking first a systems-based holistic approach. The SDGs do not do that. They are very clearly based on vertical silos. Of course, the best mind in the world working alone in a dark room would struggle to come up with a truly holistic systems-based set of performance management indicators and goals, let alone trying to do it through 193 countries in a negotiation process, some of whom are literally at war with one another. The second type of integration is the balancing of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. The goals and the targets are not bad in that regard. We've done some assessment. They do a reasonable job. Of course, when you start getting down to the targets, some of the social targets are obviously going to be biased more towards the social aims than, say, the environmental ones. The third type is where we can still do a lot of great work. That's on the interlinkages between goals and targets. And that is all about joined up working. Joined up government, joined up public policy, and joined up partnerships for action. And we have to get better at this. This is a very comprehensive agenda. It's both broad and vague. That's not a bad thing. The ambition is good for obvious reasons, and having the broad, comprehensive approach is not bad. And the vagueness is actually not necessarily even an insult. We cannot be overly prescriptive about how countries and individuals and organizations and grassroots bodies are meant to implement this. We have to leave a bit of room for interpretation. And that really is the challenge now. How do we interpret these goals to apply them to the domestic setting in all countries at once? And the last point about multi-stakeholderism links very much to that. There is very clear recognition from the governments themselves that this agenda, given its ambition and its breadth, cannot be delivered through public policy alone. We need all hands on deck. And this is very clearly linking back to a quote from Mandela. None of us acting alone can achieve success. Of course, he was talking about apartheid, but I think it very much clearly applies here as well. We are also trying to save the world as much as he was trying to save his world. The most progressive government in the world would struggle to do this by themselves. And let's be honest, we don't have the most progressive government in the world in the UK at the moment in time. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. We're going to have to pick up the slack and find ways to work together. And this links back to the universality point. This is a responsibility of all of us. We have 15 years to put the world on a sustainable pathway. We will have to change the lifestyles of all Britons to do that. And we have to overcome some of these old mindsets. Private sector is the problem. Yes, they are part of the problem. But then logically speaking, if they're part of the problem, they must be part of the solution. We have to work with them. And that requires everybody coming together for identifying new and unique ways of horizontally integrating the way in which we see the world and how we're going to change it.
It's a neat little segue from all hands on deck to Project Everyone, because our objective was always about getting the goals out there as widely as possible, to popularise them, to make them famous. If people know about their rights, then they can campaign for them and advocate for them and put pressure on not just government, but also business to try and deliver to the goals. The project was set up and devised by Richard Curtis, but he always saw the fantastic work that happened under the framework of the Millennium Development Goals. It frustrated him that people didn't know that these goals existed. You lot all know that they exist. We're a room full of development geeks, and the rest of the world didn't know that these goals existed. So Richard's challenge was, can we give this new set of goals a massive launch? He said the MDGs were the Shawshank Redemption. When it came out, no one really cared. Turned out one of the best films of all time. What he wants to do is to make the launch of the SDGs like the new Star Wars, a massive opening weekend. This time round, we set out to do 3 things. Brand the goals, give them an enormous loud launch, and then tell 7 billion people. So in terms of branding the goals, yes, We feel that the term Sustainable Development Goals is not always going to be the most attractive and useful one. So we adopted the term Global Goals. We created those beautiful icons that I'm sure most of you will have seen that represent the goals themselves. These tools were made open source for anyone to use to start getting the message of the goals out there. We wanted mass mainstream awareness. We video mapped on the side of the UN building. We raised flags everywhere from the North Pole to North Korea. And then the final bit was about trying to tell everyone that this amazing set of goals has been agreed by 193 leaders. And so we looked at the population of the planet and tried to identify how we could reach them, and then sort of went from there. We put together a lesson plan and assets for teachers to use. The world's largest lesson was taught in over 160 countries, reaching millions of children, creating this new generation of awareness and of campaigners. I set up a pop-up radio station that covered 75 different countries. We sent a text message to 935 million users. We had digital campaigns. We took over the homepage of Google, of YouTube, of MSN. There was a cinema ad. There was a poster campaign with 120,000 poster locations. And Farouk, you told me earlier how many people have heard of the goals?
Well, this is just my estimate, and it's a liberal one. I think it's 100 million people may have heard of these SDGs.
We tried everything. We think in some soft way or another, we think we might have touched 3 billion, but actually we're still only at kind of a 100 million mark. And we strongly believe that there's a massive job to do here, whereby if we all partner together with civil society, with business, with UN, with CSOs, and as individuals, we can help achieve the goals. So our plans for the year ahead, we want to continue to help create this common framework on the goals. So we want to encourage business, the NGOs, to label their activities using the goals and to use the language of the goals to talk about how all of this activity can ladder up to achieving the goals. Secondly, we want to storytell and visualize progress against the goals. Ultimately, we want people to care about the goals, so let's not talk in sort of abstracts like gender equality. Let's make it real. Every girl should have the right to go to school. Let's talk about the outcomes of the goals, and let's find ways of bringing all of this data that people are rightly excited and interested about, but let's bring it to life. Let's find ways of making it communicable and translatable. And finally, we think that there should be an annual moment to keep the global goals live and on the agenda. An accountability moment. You know, we're working with brilliant people like Data Partnerships and the People's Report Card to take this raw data, find the stories, find what's going to engage people, ordinary people, in the message of the goals.